The Vietnam War was a war waged primarily between North Vietnam and South Vietnam that soon turned into an international conflict. It all begins in the September of 1945 when Ho Chi Minh declares himself president of Northern Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, also known as Nguyen Tat Tan, Nguyen Ai Quoc, or Nguyen Sinh Khang, was the founder of the Indochina Communist Party. He is known to be one of the most influential communist leaders of the 1900s. On September 2nd of 1945, Ho Chi Minh declares himself to be the president of Northern Vietnam, with its center at Hanoi, and he maintains this position for 24 years until his death in 1969. In fact, when declaring this position, he says the words similar to those in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. All men are born equal. The Creator has given us inviolable rights, life, liberty, and happiness. In July of 1946, Ho Chi Minh refuses a proposal presented by the French. This action was the start of the small warfare that occurred between him and southern Vietnam. Back on the Western Front in 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman enlists the Truman Doctrine. This doctrine states that the U.S. will help any country in battle against communism. During this time, tides are turning in South Vietnam. In May of 1949, Emperor Bao Dai is reinstated as ruler of South Vietnam with the help of the French. Saigon becomes the capital. And of course, one country having two leaders is not going to end well with either ruler. Both leaders wanted to achieve one goal: unite Vietnam. But instead of peacefully talking this out, armed conflict begins. Now let's exit out of Vietnam for a moment. Alongside these armed conflicts going on in Vietnam, the Cold War was going on hot in the world. In 1949, to increase tensions globally, an atomic bomb is tested by the Soviet Union. Now back to Vietnam. 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Ho Chi Minh goes against the French army and comes out victorious. This victory marks the end of the 8-year-long First Indochina War. Finally, in 1954, Vietnam decides to talk things out. The Geneva Agreements effectively split Vietnam in two parts, with Ho Chi Minh controlling the northern parts and Emperor Bao Dai holding the south. Yay, peace at last! Or not? Just a little more than a year after the Geneva Agreements, Ngo Dinh Diem kicks Bao out of his role and becomes the new president of South Vietnam, or the Republic of Vietnam. And here starts the war. November 1st, 1955. The US gets involved in the war, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower decides to go against Ho Chi Minh by joining South Vietnam. With the help of American troops, Diem manages to arrest 100,000 of his own people who he believes to be Ho Chi Minh sympathizers. 1957 comes around, and Diem begins to get attacked. In 1960, the National Liberation Front, or NFL, is formed within North Vietnam. This front is made to unify North and South Vietnam by overthrowing the South Vietnamese government. The U.S. is still active in the war, and in 1961, President John F. Kennedy determines that the U.S. Army is needed in South Vietnam. 9,000 American troops are sent to South Vietnam. May 1963 rolls around with another hit on South Vietnam. Remember those 100,000 sympathizers that Diem arrested a few years back? Well, those Ho Chi Minh sympathizers were, sympathizers because Diem was a Roman Catholic. This was a fact that did not sit well with the other Buddhists in southern Vietnam, who happened to be the majority. This crisis is often called the Buddhist crisis and occurred when South Vietnamese troops took a hold of Buddhist leaders. This led to a political crisis for Diem when he ended up having his government fire on a crowd of Buddhist protesters. Just 6 months later, Diem is assassinated by some of his own generals, and Wait for it, American forces. And just 20 days after Diem's assassination, US President John F. Kennedy is also assassinated. The Vice President and Secretary of Defense then decide to increase military support. From the time period 1963 to 1965, several different groups attempt to lead South Vietnam. However, they all end up getting replaced by each other. The now acting President of the United States, President Lyndon Johnson, issues bombing in northern Vietnam. The President gives orders for Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder begins on March 2, 1965. The goal of this operation is to place pressure on the North Vietnamese military and communist leaders. Their mission is to limit their ability to fight in the war. Airstrikes began mainly focusing on the southern portion of North Vietnam, but they make their way up. Later, an issue is allowed for the bombing of all the cities in northern Vietnam, except for a select few including Hanoi. Fast forward a bit, and in October of 1968, President Johnson is forced to stop this operation due to negotiations. An estimated 30,000 civilians are killed by this operation. In June of 1965, the general of the Vietnamese government military, Nguyen Van Thai, becomes president of South Vietnam. January 30th of 1968 brings the Tet Offensive. This is a series of attacks that goes on to more than 100 cities in South Vietnam. The goal of the North in these attacks is to discourage the US from sending in troops and to form rebellion between the South Vietnamese people. Their goal ends up succeeding as the US government begins to pull back some of their troops. 2 months later, the deadly event of the My Lai massacre comes. The NFL stronghold is theorized to be the village named My Lai. US troops kill nearly all the people of the village of My Lai, including unarmed women and children. In 1969, Ho Chi Minh passes away because of a heart attack. In 1972, a new American operation called Operation Linebacker is ordered by President Nixon. This operation's goal is to destroy North Vietnam's air defense and to stop any supplies towards their military by destroying railroads and bridges. In 1973, President Nixon signs the Paris Peace Accords. This ends the direct involvement of the war. Finally, the war comes to an end on April 30th of 1975. South and North Vietnam become unified under the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. So, let's recap. The Vietnam War lasted for approximately 20 years in the 20th century. It put the US and South Vietnam against Communist North Vietnam and its allies. This was during the ongoing Cold War between the US and Soviet Union, and this war ended up intensifying the Cold War. The basic cause of the Vietnam War was the concept of communism. The Truman Doctrine stated that the US would help stop the spread of communism, thus bringing the US into battle. By 1954, Vietnam had forcibly driven out the French and Japanese intruders, which led to Ho Chi Minh creating the League for Independence, or Viet Minh, as a sign for independence, and this league was based on communist ideals. As a result, North Vietnam wanted to secure the entire Vietnam under communism, and was backed by China and the Soviet Union. The Vietnam War resulted in a tragic number of casualties. As a rough estimate, 200,000 South Vietnamese troops were killed, 58,000 US troops were killed, and 1.1 million North Vietnamese troops were killed. Along with that, 2 million North Vietnamese civilians perished in all the bombings and fights that went down in the war. In the US, the troops were not given respect as the US had lost to a less powerful country. And in Vietnam, there was terrible destruction. Entire villages were destroyed, chemicals were dumped, and a horrifying 800,000 children were orphaned. And even after the war, unexploded substances left behind from Operation Rolling Thunder have killed thousands and thousands of people, even after the American troops left. It's important to remember past events such as the Vietnam War, to learn from these mistakes and wins in order to secure a better and safer future for all of us. Thanks for watching NFAN.